Today we are joined by Dr. Hasan Jeffries, and he will be discussing the intersections of race, class, and Hurricane Katrina. Dr. Jeffries is Associate Professor of History at The Ohio State University, where he has been teaching courses on the civil rights and Black Power movement for the last 18 years. He earned a BA in History from Morehouse College in 1994 and a PhD in American History with a specialization in African American History from Duke University in 2002. Dr. Jeffries has worked on several public history projects, including serving as the lead historian for the 5-year, $25 million renovation of the National Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee. He is also the host of the podcast Teaching Hard History, American Slavery, a production of the Teaching Tolerance Division of the Southern Poverty Law Center. So thank you, Dr. Jeffries, so much for being with us here this evening. Please
take it away.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Leanne. And thank you, of course, for the invitation and the opportunity to share some thoughts and ideas and some reflections on Hurricane Katrina, past and lessons learned, what led up to it, and what were some of the lessons learned. It's always good, even virtually, to be with the Bexley Public Library, the Bexley community, and now we can even expand beyond. I see a number of Buckeyes with Ohio State history connections, Jessica and Emma and Brianna. So it's good to be in good company. I want to share my screen here. I have a couple images I want to share with everyone as we talk this evening. And by all means, please, as you all are thinking about this event and sort of the intersections of race and class, use the chat function, chat features to share questions, share thoughts, comments, and ideas. I'll take us to about the bottom of the hour, and then we will open it up for a little virtual conversation, a little virtual dialogue. So get comfortable, sit back, think and remember, and for those who were too young, because it doesn't seem like 15 years ago, but now it is 15 years ago, perhaps some new insights to be offered on what happened. When we think about Hurricane Katrina, which made landfall, and we'll say a little bit more about sort of its intensity, its historic intensity at the time, you really have to begin by understanding the city of New Orleans and its particular vulnerability. New Orleans is a city below the sea, if you will. It literally sits below sea level. And so in this image here, you will see that Lake Pontchartrain, which is off to your right on the screen, the city in the middle, and then to the left, the Mississippi River. And so literally the city of New Orleans is a bowl. And the great fear, so it suffers from flooding all the time, but the great fear was that once in a millennium, hurricane would then push water into this bowl. And if the edges of the city were topped, then the city itself would flood. You will see there have been and continue to be these levee walls designed to protect the city, adding extra height, both along the Mississippi River, along Lake Pontchartrain, to prevent the mighty river and the lake from flooding, overflowing, overtopping these levees, and then flooding the city. What you can't see here necessarily there are a number of canals that crisscross the city. Now, these canals are very important because New Orleans is a port city and a major hub of natural gas, oil, transportation, access to the Gulf of Mississippi, to the Gulf of Mexico, the endpoint of the Mississippi River. So it's a major hub. And so you have these canals that crisscross the city, a couple major ones, and these will factor in important ways to the human catastrophe, the human disaster that would actually occur. But the key point is that New Orleans is because of where it sits and how its elevation below the sea has been susceptible to flooding and to this kind of once in a century, once in a millennium kind of natural event. Scale and scope. We had not seen a hurricane like this. As a Hurricane Katrina in the summer, it's building in August, in the summer of 2005, began to build up steam. It was unclear, if you may remember, where exactly it was going to hit. But very soon, as late August began to approach, it kind of became clear as it made its way. It wasn't going to be an Atlantic storm. It was going to come up the coast as it was zeroing in on the Gulf of Mississippi, that it may in fact have a direct hit on New Orleans. Now, the size and scope is important because as it was approaching, we're talking about approaching as a Category 5. So it eventually, as it made landfall, it had winds as high as 175 miles per hour. This is important because that infrastructure, those levees that were built both along Lake Pontchartrain and the Mississippi River, but then also the levees supporting the canals, essentially built by the federal government, the Army of Engineers, they were only built to withstand a Category 3 hurricane. So far fewer winds. And this would, this is a gamble that we made as a nation, that we made as a federal government, in terms of investing our resources in infrastructure, choosing not to build or fortify, strengthen, build out these levees just in case a hurricane of the scale and scope, size and scope of Katrina came. The point is that as Katrina approached, we knew we were in some trouble. New Orleans knew it was in some trouble. The Gulf knew it was in some trouble, that if it held its course, that this would do some serious damage, that this was the hurricane that everyone feared. Because the state and local authorities, the weather, NOAA, the National Weather Service, were predicting that this was going to be serious, as this was big, that this was the proverbial big one. There were mandatory evacuations. People were told to leave the city. They did not have an option. They were asked to go. The governor, the mayor of New Orleans in the back, Ray Nagin, said, look, you got to get out of the city. This would factor in to what would become this human disaster. The natural part of this disaster is, look, there's a big hurricane coming. You got to go. But the transportation, the evacuation plan, and this is where we begin to see the class coming into play. The evacuation plan was based on everyone having their own transportation. So, hey, the city and state officials, governor, city officials, mayor, say, look, you got to go. You got to get out of New Orleans. This is serious. This is coming. It's big. Could be as big as it's already a Category 5 in the Gulf. You got to go. But what if you don't have a car? What if you can't go? What if you would like to go, but there is no public transportation? There is no transportation being made available for those who do not have automobiles. And so it's great that all the highways wind up pushing away from New Orleans, are redirected, everything either going north up to Baton Rouge or west along I-20, I-10, west away from the hurricane. But if you don't have a car, you can't go. You can't outwalk a hurricane. And this would factor in significantly in the days ahead. On August 29, on a Sunday evening, 2005, the Hurricane Katrina makes landfall. it comes in force. It comes with these high winds. It's pushing. The winds create 20-foot storm surges. So essentially, the Mississippi River, because the storm surge is so strong, being churned up by the wind, actually begins to push upstream. And as it begins to push upstream, you begin to have some spillover, some flooding. Some of the levees are overtopped. There is some heavy flooding a little bit. But actually, if you will remember, and I was at my wife at the time was working as a government contractor, and she was actually working in Hawaii. And so I got a chance to go out there and do some work too while she was working in Hawaii. And I remember going to sleep and that Sunday night, and it appeared that the city was going to be spared, that it had suffered the brunt of the landfall, that there wasn't going to be this catastrophic flooding. The levees appeared not to be topped. They had been built high enough. They were going to hold. But as Monday came, the worst began to come true. This is the 17th, one of those canals, the 17th Street Canal. At first, when it became clear that this levee had given way, the thinking was that the levee had been topped, that the storm surge was just too big, too great, and that the levee had been topped. It would be revealed after investigations by the Army Corps of Engineers and investigative reporters and the like, that this levee, and that's the lower Ninth Ward, which is predominantly African-American neighborhood, 98% African-American neighborhood, which is in the lowest level. So while New Orleans is essentially completely under sea level, there are pockets that are on higher ground. And so while some parts of the bowl will fill, there are neighborhoods that are not as low, as far below sea level. So while some of the area of the city would fill up, some parts of it would stay above ground. In fact, 80% of the city, 80% of New Orleans, 80% of that bowl would be filled with water as high as 20 feet. It would be massive. Essentially all of the lower Ninth Ward would be filled with water. And as it turned out, the levees were not breached. The levees were not overtopped. The height had held. What actually happened is the levees failed. The levees broke on these canals. They literally collapsed under the pressure. They had not been built properly, and they had not been fortified and strengthened. So what we see here on the 17th, and there were about 50 or so of these breaches, not overtopping, but breaches, is the failure of the infrastructure that had been built to protect the city. And on this side, it literally was water flooding into, devastating a predominantly African-American neighborhood that was on one of the lowest parts of the city. So it's important that we understand that had these levees actually been built in such a way to withstand the natural forces of nature, they would have, in fact, the city, for the most part, would have been spared. But the fact that they weren't built the way they should have been or reinforced, and in fact, it would come out that the Army Corps of Engineers knew that if faced with the kind of hurricane forces that we saw in Katrina, that these levees would be susceptible to breaking. So in that sense, the fact that they came only as a surprise to the people who were there, but not as a surprise to the people who were in charge of their maintaining them, and to those who had been looking at them, particularly scientists saying that this was a disaster waiting to happen. As a result of that breach, as I said, literally 80% of the city, 80% of a major metropolitan city, one of the largest cities in the United States, is completely submerged underwater. This is an image of like 2 days before the hurricane and 2 days after, and you can see the flooding, the massive flooding in the downtown area. Covering the corridors of the interstates and the Superdome, which is the white top in the back for those who can be, which will will factor in as a major player in this evolving and emerging story. What became clear shortly after those levees breached and the city began to flood, and it began to flood very quickly, is that there were literally tens of thousands of people who were still in the city. And the vast majority of these people did not stay behind because they were among those who doubted the ferocity of the storm that was coming. The majority of people who stayed behind because they couldn't leave, stayed behind because they didn't have personal cars. They didn't have personal transportation, did not have access to personal transportation to leave the city. They stayed behind because they were elderly and were unable to move, were unable to leave. They stayed behind because they did not have the means, the financial means to either rent personal transportation or find transportation, pay someone, take a bus, take a train, find a flight, pay for a flight out of the city. And so those who are stranded, those who are left behind, are those who cannot afford to leave the city, those who are not able to leave the city. So one of the things that happens in the moment is that those who are abandoned, those who are left behind, are criticized for not leaving. That you were told that you got to go, and if you don't leave, we can't help you, and therefore any fate that befalls you is of your own doing, and that becomes part of a narrative that emerges in the minutes and the hours and the days immediately after Katrina hits landfall. But it becomes quite clear in retrospect that the evacuation plan was not designed to get everybody out of the city. The evacuation plan was only designed to allow those who could leave the city to actually leave the city. And as a result, a part of this evacuation plan that had been developed was that, okay, if you can't leave the city, if you don't leave the city, then head to the Superdome as a shelter of last resort. The Superdome, of course, is a major sports and multi-purpose arena located in the heart of downtown. And so people begin to make their way. Remember, 80% of the city is flooded. And if you Google some of the images, and especially some of the video, it's really harrowing and also heartbreaking to see people wading through this sludge. Of course, New Orleans is a part of that natural gas, natural energy pipeline. So all kinds of refineries and the like that have been impacted, oil tankers and spills and gas spills, environmental catastrophes. This isn't just a human disaster. The Katrina would also be an environmental catastrophe. To see these folk wading through water in the heat and humidity, that was also a factor. This is late August, early September, the heat and humidity of New Orleans, and trying to make their way to higher ground, trying to make their way to the Superdome. One of the things that will happen as news reports are broadcasting, and for those who remember these helicopter shots, one of the things that will happen is eventually the federal government will respond. but they come in late. But on the ground immediately is the United States Coast Guard. And they almost instantly, as soon as the weather calms, right? So the storm passes, but the flooding is still there. Then the Coast Guard begins to go in, and many of you will remember those images of Coast Guard rescuers going almost house to house as people would have gotten trapped in their roofs and then break out of their roofs, knocking through, and they're standing and trying to flag down these Coast Guard cutters that are helicopters that are flying ahead, sending down baskets to bring people up. You have other folk who are wading through the water, trying to get to higher ground, trying to get to the New Orleans Superdome. And you still had some reporters on the ground, right? The intrepid news reporter who is still there, Anderson Cooper, you know, he goes where every hurricane is. So Anderson Cooper is down there blowing in the wind. But they have these images, right, are beginning to come out of New Orleans, right? And as Wolf Blitzer said at one point, he says these people, they're so black and they're so poor, right? I mean, it's like the expression, I don't know what's going on. Like, what's happening here? And they were, because it was the folk who were left behind. It was mostly African-American, mostly lower income, poor black folk who got left behind, as well as the elderly, as well as the sick and the infirm. And so we begin to see these images coming out that show it, and folk in desperation, right? I mean, so you're not walking around in the middle of a hurricane, trapped in a flood, and you have to escape your home, but wearing a nice a shirt and tie and suspenders, right? I mean, it is hot, and you are at this point fending for your life, and there is no help around. There is no local police presence of any significant means that is providing aid and assistance. Everyone is on their own. People are trying to get to the Superdome. There is no power. There is no electricity. There is no running water. So you can get to the Superdome, but you don't want to go inside because it's hot as Hades inside, right? So you have some folk who are inside, but it's just as hot outside. And so you have these images of folk just spread out, right? Trying to stay out of the water, you know, trying to find some shelter. And this goes on for several days. And those images, and people are pleading for aid and for assistance. And it was not forthcoming immediately. One of the things that happens too is there begin to be these narratives and these myths, misconceptions, stories, fables begin to emerge and begin to circulate on television. And one of those is that the Superdome had become this place of sort of complete civil chaos, right? That there were murders, that there were women and children who were being raped. I mean, all of and that had everything to do with the images that were being broadcast. You have poor Black folk who are obviously in a desperate situation. And instead of seeing what they were doing as folk trying to survive, which is what they were doing, actually coming together, helping each other. There were images of people pulling elderly folk, the sick and infirm, on mattresses as makeshift rafts to safety, or at least to higher ground. But rather than them being folk talking about them as survivors in an urban city, they begin this narrative of these folk are as animals is the only thing that can come to mind, right? And that they're so desperate that they are now dangerous. So folk who have been abandoned and now have to turn to, breaking into CVS to get diapers for babies, to get water, to get food, to get nourishment for the elderly. Now they suddenly are being described as looters and as dangerous, as criminals, and as taking advantage of the situation, rather than being described as what they were, as victims. And this had real world consequences, because while New Orleans was underwater, there were suburbs surrounding the city that were not, that had suffered some damage for sure, but they still were in a far better situation and place than Black folk were in the city. And these bridges leading out of the city, the highways leading out of the city, suddenly you begin to see literally white posses, white militias of armed white folk in these suburban communities, armed police in these communities, standing in the way of folk who were trying to get to safety, turning them back at the point of at gunpoint, saying that they will not be allowed to enter into these neighborhoods and being turned away. So rather than, as we like to think, that disasters bring out the best in people, in this instance, it brought out the worst. We did not see that extended, especially as it came to supporting those who were trying to survive. Within the bubble of New Orleans, folk were taking care of each other, in fact, but it was others who had access to means who were not. The people were also being terrorized by the police. New Orleans has a long history of police corruption, a long history of police violence and police abuse. And we saw that playing out in extreme ways immediately after Katrina. Police were given orders to shoot looters, if you can imagine. Folk trying to secure resources given the desperate situation that they were in, had been given orders to protect property using lethal force. There were, at the end, a real reckoning. Some police just simply abandoned their position and responsibility to help and serve. Others literally killed those who they were sworn to protect. A number of people afterward faced federal prosecution for murder. One famous incident in which 2 police officers killed somebody who was retrieving some goods, put his body in his car, and then set the car on fire. Some 200 police officers would eventually be dismissed from the force for essentially criminal activity. So people are being abandoned, people are being terrorized. And then you also have eventually and people being displaced. And this is an important aspect of the story too. This is an image of not of the New Orleans Superdome, but of the Astrodome, another major sporting arena in Houston, Texas. So Houston and Baton Rouge, the 2 closest major cities to New Orleans. Eventually, as Black folk, as New Orleans residents are able to get out of the city, they're put on these buses and literally sent across the country. Some are taken to Louis Armstrong Airport, put on planes, and they're flown out of the city. Stories of folk like, I didn't even know where I was going. They just put us on a plane. I just got on a bus. I didn't even know what city I was going to. Next thing I knew, I woke up, I was in Utah. But the heaviest concentrations are Baton Rouge and in Houston, Texas. But the stories, and this is important, the stories that were being told about those who were surviving and left behind, suddenly as folk who, this diaspora of New Orleans residents, wind up and try to settle in places like Houston and try to settle in places like Baton Rouge, suddenly they become targets themselves, right? They get labeled as a sort of a criminal element, and we don't want them here, right? They're dangerous, they're criminals and stuff like that. But then you also have, as Barbara Bush, the mother of the then president, George Bush, they have Houston roots, they have Texas roots, and she goes through and does kind of a walkthrough at the Houston Astrodome. And she actually says, well, this isn't the best, but it's probably better than anything they had before. And it's like, what? Really? Really, Barbara? That's what you got? That's what you got? Sleeping on a cot. You really think that's better than anything anybody else had before? So there was a real disconnect from many between providing the support that others genuinely needed. A couple more slides and then we'll open it up. Eventually relief will come in the form of federal officers, and they will provide some water, and most importantly, they provide transportation out of the city. There was no need for a heavy military presence to put down any kind of insurrection or major violence. That did not exist. It was all myth and mythology. But they were needed to get people out, of the city. And some of you may remember the African-American General Russell Honore, who still appears and talks about catastrophes and the like. He led that. And finally, and actually going in, there's a famous video of him riding in as the mayor at the time, Ray Nagin, said, this John Wayne dude. And he ain't call him a dude, he called him another a sort of friendly term. And, he said, we needed him. And he's famous, he's coming and telling the soldiers who have been stationed, who once they get, he's like, put your guns down. Like, these are civilians. These are our citizens. These are our people. These people are not dangerous. They're not criminals. Why do you have your guns up? Put your guns down, point them down. Don't point them at our people. There was a real human cost to this tragedy. There were nearly 2,000 people who died. Some 1,800 plus wind up dying in New Orleans. And had they been evacuated, had a plan been in place to take care of them and get them out of the city, very likely they would have survived. Some 100,000 homes are destroyed. There are images of, I remember going down the following year to the lower Ninth Ward, and literally it was like a moonscape. The homes had been filled with water, had to come down and are bulldozed. So that's part of the human cost. 15 million people are evacuated. So we're talking about a major movement of people, which means that you have to leave the city, but you got to wind up someplace else, and the impact that would have on folk. And 250,000 folk from New Orleans, mainly African-American, would be displaced, would not find their way back home, certainly not immediately. And they would be in concentration cities like Baton Rouge and New Orleans and Houston, but literally they'd be scattered across the country. FEMA did a poor job of providing housing. And then, of course, folk get sent up, for example, to New York, and they wind up being put up in hotels for a month, 2 months, 3 months, and then eventually FEMA says, "Well, yeah, that's about it. We're done providing housing for you. Good luck." And then folk were being turned out. So that the displaced population is part of that human cost and that human toll. When we put it all together, it is clear that Katrina was a natural event and an extreme weather phenomenon. And we over the last 15 years, as a product of global warming, undoubtedly, we have seen increasing numbers of these extreme weather phenomena. Superstorm Sandy that hit New York not too long ago is an example of that. It was a natural event, but it was also a human disaster. The catastrophe was a function of human society failing. So not a natural disaster, a natural event, but a human disaster. Its impact disproportionately and overwhelmingly affects African Americans, because New Orleans, in order to understand the impact that happened at the moment, you got to understand that New Orleans was rigidly segregated by race. And that also meant that African Americans, because of this historic segregation and the fact that they have been discriminated against in terms of where they could live. So Black folk are living in particular neighborhoods like the lower Ninth Ward, not only because they like other Black folk, but because they were not allowed to purchase homes in white neighborhoods. And not surprisingly, the white neighborhoods were those neighborhoods that were on higher elevation, that were still below sea level, still in the city, but higher elevation. So they were not impacted in the same way that a place like the lower Ninth Ward, which is in the lowest elevation of the city, which is completely devastated. And that's where overwhelming numbers of African Americans resided in those parts. Poverty was also concentrated. So poverty was not spread out throughout the city. Poverty was concentrated in particular areas, in particular neighborhoods. So people couldn't rely on other folk around them who might have had resources and enabled them to get out of the city and survive and endure. They were in the same boat, literally, except they didn't have any boats as everyone else. And that also meant that there were high areas where folks just had no resources, no financial means, no transportation resources to get out, creating or a recipe, or this was the recipe for this human catastrophe. The infrastructure failing, in other words, the refusal on the part of the nation to invest in this vital infrastructure that could have saved the city. Look, any reasonable person now would say, look, you don't build a city below sea level with a lake the size of an ocean on one side and the mighty Mississippi on the other. But human beings have been living there as long as human beings have been around. And certainly the city of New Orleans goes back centuries. But the reality is what had been built to protect the people in the city failed. And that failure wasn't just at the moment of construction. The failure was at the refusal, the continuing refusal to invest in strengthening, invest in improving the infrastructure. And that infrastructure failing, the levees not being over top, but the levees breaching, really was a function of priorities and a failure to prioritize an investment, a large-scale investment, but an investment nonetheless in infrastructure. And lastly, the poor pre-planning. Not only the evacuation that was centered on middle class and people possessing their resources themselves to get out, but also a negligent federal response. The federal government planned only for what they could do, or what they had the resources to do at the time. They did not plan for what could happen, which is what actually happened. And then the incompetence of the Bush administration of the time, not only in the pre-planning, but then also in the response, the mighty delay to get people out of the city, when they ought to have known that there are, in all of these evacuation plans, that there will be people left behind who needed real assistance. And then lastly, this last pointing out, we'll open it up to some questions. Housing, this is going back to that segregation point. Housing and transportation are really central to understanding what happened, because housing, and in this little graph that we came up with the Kirwan Institute to help explain what we saw with what happened in Katrina, is that housing is so critical, because housing determines your access to opportunity. Housing determines your access to healthcare. Housing determines your access to jobs, what jobs are available to you in your neighborhood. Housing determines what kinds of schools and the quality of those schools that are available to you. 50% of New Orleans schools before Katrina hit were considered to be failing and substandard. That's that concentration of poverty as well. Housing and transportation. One of the things that became clear as a result of Katrina is that this reliance on personal transportation did a real disservice to those without means, to the least among us in our society. And housing determines your access to transportation. So not only had we been underinvesting and divesting, taking money out of critical infrastructure needs, but also out of transportation. So how we have been prioritizing the city, how we have been prioritizing our society, created the equation, the formula for the disaster that became Hurricane Katrina. That intersection. And so as Wolf Blitzer was looking at these videos, the CNN anchor, and he says, they're so Black and they're so poor, that was not an accident. It was the result of policies that had been developed literally over decades that created the scenario for the catastrophe that resulted from this natural event. And unfortunately, we still haven't learned the lessons of what the policies that we have that disadvantage some, how that can then disproportionately create harm on those groups when natural phenomenon, natural events occur. And we're living through that right now. And hopefully we'll have a chance to talk a little bit about that during the question and answer session. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and invite Leanne back, and then maybe we can field some questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm sure everybody at home is cheering, so I will clap for everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Jeffries. What a fabulous presentation. We did get a couple great questions, very thoughtful questions in Zoom and Facebook. So Jeff is going to try to share his screen so that people are able to read them while I ask them to you. Okay. So our first one comes from Brian on Zoom. How did the relocation of the individuals to other cities impact the fabric of New Orleans in the following decade?
Oh, that's a great question, because the relocation and the dislocation of residents has had a significant impact on New Orleans. First, the population of New Orleans decreased significantly. Like overnight, the city practically disappeared. It goes from a city of 500,000 to a city of about 250,000 in the immediate years afterward. A lot of the folk who left never returned. They just simply don't have the means to return. And these, in many ways, was their ancestral home. New Orleans is probably, and the residents of New Orleans are among the most, the city itself is probably one of the most unique cities in the United States, owing to the fact that it has that rich French tradition, the Creole tradition, the sort of the coming out of that sort of colonial era, if you will, the mix of African American, Native American, and French. So New Orleans is so unique, and it really is a tragedy that folk were not able to come back. New Orleans today looks different than it did 15 years ago. One of the things that happens is that the Latino population actually increases substantially because of demand, because of that housing loss, 100,000 homes lost and destroyed. There was a huge surge in need for construction labor, housing labor. And so there's a mighty influx of migrant workers, Latino migrant workers coming from Texas, who, because the need was so great, they find work, but then they also, that work extends for a number of years, and a number of them just simply stay there. They never leave. And so as a direct result, we see an increase, a significant increase in the Latino population, and a decrease in the African-American population, because those who were displaced don't have, as families, don't have the means to come back. And so that, and that changes the fabric of the city. When you lose folk who have that rich heritage, you bring other folk in who are coming with a different cultural eye and cultural dynamic. And then the other thing that changes is there's massive investment in the city, massive capital investment, not only from the federal government, but by corporations, because New Orleans then becomes kind of this little experiment, right? We see it in education. Like, well, public schools are doing bad, so we're just gonna make everything a charter school, right? And it becomes this sort of weird experimental place. But because of this investment, it also becomes a little bit of a technology hub. And so New Orleans is also significantly younger than it was before. And I don't know if I said this, but half of the 2,000, 1,800 or so folk who died directly as a result of Katrina, saying nothing about the sort of the mental health effects, but half of them were senior citizens. So it was the elderly. So it wasn't just poor folk, right? It was that combination of the poor and elderly that are impacted the most, which is what we're actually seeing again in the COVID-19 response, that some 50% of those who are dying are the elderly, who are in nursing homes and elder care and the like. So the most vulnerable in our population always suffer when we have these natural events that get exacerbated by poor planning and poor policy.
That's actually one of the other questions that a couple people have asked is, but you sort of brought it up. I'm curious if you think that the capital investment in New Orleans is like a net positive overall, like if you think, because you said that corporations, and I know sometimes the communities don't necessarily think it's great if big companies come in and like pour money in. But a lot of people are wondering, what are some parallels that you see between the government response to Hurricane Katrina and how the government is currently handling the COVID-19 pandemic? And the slides for Jeff are going to be off here, but since you brought it up, I thought we might as well go to that question.
Yeah, no problem. No, and it's important because when I was saying that we there's lessons to be learned, and we clearly have not learned the lessons. When Katrina hit, and looking back at it, people were like, "Oh my God, like 2,000 people have died," right? Like we didn't know how many. Like even at the time, people were saying, "Man, it could be 5,000, could be 10,000 people who have died." Like we don't know. We're at 150,000 people who have died as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic within a 6-month period, and that number is going to increase. I mean, but proportionally, it's hard to even wrap our minds around, right? I mean, we're almost numb to it. If we were, you look at the same thing, like 9/11, we have about 2,500, 3,500 people. I forget maybe I think it's maybe 5,000. I forget what the actual number is when you combine them. 9/11 is an event that lasts an hour, right? As a New Yorker, is always close to my heart, but the buildings come down, the planes hit, that's it. The actual event is over. Now, the consequences will ripple on, of course, right? But the event is a moment. Katrina is essentially, the hurricane hits on a Sunday, the floods happen on Monday. By Saturday, within a week, pretty much everybody is out. It seemed like forever to get those federal troops in, but by the end of the week, certainly by 2, it's been cleared out. We're talking about 6 months now that this epidemic has been going on, pandemic, and it's getting worse, not better. By comparison, the time frame and also the numbers, and what we needed was a better response. And so I think 2 things are real parallels here. One, the failure of the federal government to provide a national way forward, national leadership, right? Like that is just, historians will look back and they will look at this moment and the failure of a national plan, national leadership, regardless of politics and what you think about the person occupying the White House. He has failed to provide the leadership that is necessary. And that has cost people their lives because the politics of it have trickled down. So the other thing is, Katrina was also regional, right? I mean, it's in one city, it's in one place, right? So it's kind of localized, although it of course extends to Mississippi. The Gulf gets hit really hard. We're talking about a national, this is what we're experiencing now is national, and we don't have a national recovery plan, and we're still in the midst of it. So that is also tragic. But the other parallel that is real is that although there is the federal government, the Bush administration was not responsible for Hurricane Katrina, right? George and Barbara weren't in the Atlantic Ocean, running in circles, right, creating a hurricane. Just as the present administration is not responsible for this virus, right? It was not created in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, but they are absolutely responsible for the inadequate response that has cost the lives of so many people. That's point one. But it's also predictable that the majority of people who have been suffering the worst in a state like Atlanta, in a state like Georgia, where some 60 or 70%, in the city of Atlanta, 60 or 70% of the people who are suffering from COVID-19 are winding up in hospitals that are dying are African American, that the disproportionate impact is on Black folk, Latinos, Indigenous folk, and poor folk is also predictable because of the way in which we have denied adequate health care and health services to people of color, and especially people of color of limited means. And so once again, the least among us, both in terms of the elderly, both in terms of those with, as we all know the term now, comorbidities, existing health conditions, those who are, one of the things that happened with Katrina is some people felt that I can't leave because my job is here, right? And if this isn't a direct hit, I can't afford to miss days and come back. We're seeing that working class folk are on the front lines in terms of working, essential workers, right? Working at Popeyes, you're an essential worker, and they can't get out. And so they can't quarantine, they can't isolate, right? They're at risk of being exposed simply because of their economic condition and status. And I fear that, what will happen going down the road. The other thing that is really important to keep in mind with this catastrophe that is now that is absolutely no longer a natural event, but a man-made, a human-made catastrophe, because we could have stopped this certainly before it got to these levels, is that now what do? Because we have created a healthcare system that puts your access to healthcare through your employment. We now are talking about 30 million people who are unemployed, right? So how do they get healthcare, right? So the fact that we have not created a national healthcare system and have not really strengthened a healthcare safety net to provide for people, but have come up with this crazy notion that employers, that's the way you get healthcare. We are going to continue to reap the ill effects of that plan going forward.
Ooh, you gave me chills. Yeah. So we have a couple more questions here. I guess, so to follow up, sort of, as you're saying, it seems like there isn't really, history keeps repeating itself. And so we have two questions here. One of them asks sort of, it seems like the government used those who were unable to leave as a convenient scapegoat for their failure to make accommodations. And this is from Emma on Zoom. And she wonders if the government has ever admitted to their failure or provided financial support to them. And then I also sort of want to add this other question, because I think that everything you've sort of been talking about speaks to like the systemic racism that's plaguing everything and how deeply it goes. And so Brianna on Zoom also asked, I'm making this very difficult for Jeff to share the questions, but she said, they said, what is really sticking in my mind is your mention of the sludge that many residents were wading through, stemming from surrounding oil refineries, industry, etc. It can't be a coincidence that there is a concentration of these types of industries around the hardest hit and impoverished areas of the city. Could you speak more to the legacy of environmental racism in the city, both at the time of Katrina and now?
Yeah, no, the two are absolutely connected. The environmental racism, the racism around housing and where you can live. So we know that disproportionately people of color and especially lower income folk are disproportionately concentrated in environmentally high risk areas. And so that not only means areas where, in the case of New Orleans, where land is most likely to be susceptible to flooding, but also areas that are most likely to suffer from pollution, right? So the least desirable places in our society is where you have the highest concentrations of poor folk and poor people who are people of color. And we're continuing to see that now, because that's not just where you live, but again, going back to the notion, as Brianna pointed out, the notion of sort of housing, right? What's the legacy of sort of the environmental racism? It's not just where you live and what the sort of the toxins that you may be exposed to, but it also means that you're not going to have adequate access or access to adequate healthcare. And since Katrina, 2005, we have seen a consolidation actually in healthcare providers in terms of hospitals. So more and more people in rural communities that tend to be poor, more and more folk in urban communities, in urban neighborhoods that tend to be poor, do not have access to adequate health care. And so it wasn't a surprise, for example, that when New York became a hotspot for the coronavirus, that it began to peak in areas that were overwhelmingly Black, that were overwhelmingly Latino, and that were overwhelmingly poor. And they were dependent upon access to, they were dependent upon public health services that because they couldn't afford private health services that offered, just because of resources, more adequate care. And so one of the things that we see, if you put it all together, if you're disproportionately likely to live in high toxic environments, in environments that will negatively impact your health, and you don't have access to adequate healthcare to deal with the consequences of that, you will wind up, for example, being in poorer health. And being in poorer health has proven to be deadly during this moment of this global pandemic. It is not a surprise that those who have that are the least healthy, and certainly COVID-19, the coronavirus can impact anybody, but those who are least healthy are most likely to suffer a devastating outcome if they contract the virus. And that has everything to do, and not only with poverty and access to adequate food and healthcare, but also where you are living, that environment. And no, to go back to Emma's question, no, the federal government has not really ever sort of issued kind of reparations, if you will, for its failure. There were some, and even insurance companies. I mean, it's been going on for a while. Like, it wasn't really a hurricane. It was, or you may have had insurance for flooding, but it wasn't the hurricane that caused the flooding. It was the breach, and you didn't have like breach of levee coverage, right? So when it comes down to it, even the private insurance companies, the federal government really never owned up to the mistakes that they made that led to the devastation, not only for the physical infrastructures of the city, but also the impact on people themselves.
Wow. So thank you so much again for being here. And this has been, a pretty bleak sort of topic. And so not that I'm expecting you to kind of offer some sort of like hope, but clearly everyone who is attending this and watching this has some sort of vested interest or, in how to do our part to not allow this to happen again. And so I was wondering, like, if you could kind of point to something. We all hear the tragedies, like in when Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, how even though like aid was available, it wasn't distributed, or the places where you send your money don't actually get distributed. And so what can we as sort of the voting public and those of us with a lot of privilege, how do we sort of help? What is the best thing that we can do to stop any of this from happening again?
Yeah, well, I think not only happen again, but how can we stop the disaster that we're in, that's unfolding right now?
Right now.
That is literally we are in the midst of.
Right.
Now, of course, there are, sort of the private avenues of action, right? And, volunteer organizations and the like that are really doing good work. We know that individually we can, in the disaster that we're in, right, because it's unfolding, that there is literally a part that we can play to help stop it. Like you couldn't, there weren't enough people and sandbags to stop these levees from breaking, right? But we know that social distancing and wearing masks, as simple as that, can stop this hurricane, this disaster, right? We can be the levee ourselves. So individually, we have to do that, and we have to push back against the silliness of like, no, you can't do anything. I mean, all that sort of political rhetoric. So individually, yes, there is something that we can do, with our own bodies and put ourselves in the breach. We can also, those who have means and resources, they can, contribute in various ways to the various organizations that are helping people who are losing family members. And now we haven't said anything about the bills and the costs of folk who are having to spend tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars if you go on a ventilator and the like. So there's a real need there. But I think in the end, we actually have to, force the federal government to actually do its job. What we saw in Katrina was the federal government did not do its job. And that is because these aren't, Louisiana, the city of New Orleans, the state of Louisiana did not have the resources to step in and respond to the disaster as it was unfolding. And the federal government is the only one that can marshal those types of resources. And that is absolutely, and that's just one city in one place. That is absolutely the case right now. The federal government has the responsibility and duty to provide that central leadership. And the federal government under the present administration has completely abdicated that responsibility and has left it up to the 50 states to design their own action, to access their own resources. And that has been a unqualified disaster. And so whatever can be done, and there's only another 90 days, 89 days, I'm counting, before the next general election. And so we all have to do, if you're serious, if you understand the role that the federal government has to play, and you know the position of the person in the office now is like, I'm not going to do anything about it. Literally, he just said, it is what it is. Then part of your responsibility is to say, no, we need somebody to do something different. We need a federal government to do something different. Now, that doesn't mean we wait for 90 days and then another 60 days after that. You put the pressure on the government now. And if the federal government won't do it, then you got to put the pressure on your state government and on your local governments to make sure, in this instance, Governor DeWine, who just realized that, he literally has coronavirus himself, and, disagree, whether you're a fan of his politics or not, I wish him well, and hope he comes through this without harm. But we need real leadership there, right? There was, we were going really well. And then, kind of around June, we push out Dr. Acton, we say, all right, we're going to go with politics and not public health. And then suddenly we see the spike, right? The surge again. And that's bad governing, right? Not bad government, that's bad governing. And so we need better governing now, just that even more so now, because this is ongoing. I mean, you're talking about, 2,000 versus they're talking about by the end of this year, by October, November, over 200,000 people dying as a direct result. And that's just what can be documented. And we're still playing around like whether or not you want to wear a mask. It doesn't make any sense. Mm-hmm. So we have to be vocal, and we have to put pressure on not only government officials, but then also our schools, also our churches, right? All those institutions that think they could kind of weather this storm by doing things in a normal way, or not doing things fully. We have to put pressure on them in order to save lives. Like it is literally that serious, right? To do this stuff means to save lives, right? Yeah. Last thing, I know we're over time, but look, I've been locked up in here with my kids. I never get to talk to them. So, like, you're just thinking about the sports, right? Like I teach at Ohio State, right? And I was for the last 4 years on the athletic council, which I'm no longer on. So now I can speak freely. Right? It's insane that we're talking about putting these kids out here to play football and to play sports, right? Like why? Like football is not worth a person's life, period.
Yeah. I certainly don't think so. Right.
And I'm a sports fan, right? But no. And the kids now in the Big Ten, especially the Black athletes in the Big Ten, in the Pac-12, they had just released a statement on this, and they're like, "Look, what are y'all doing? You can't be serious." Yeah. If Major League sports are having trouble, Major League Baseball and the like, right? And we only see that like basketball, professional basketball, is going through these extreme measures of actually living in a bubble. You can't keep any football team in a bubble on a college campus. Like that's not going to happen. Like, what are you talking about? So we have to get serious, I think, about public policy in this short term. There is no return to normal. But that's what we can do. We can raise our voices. We can tell people, no, this is inadequate. Don't put people's lives at risk and at jeopardy, because this is literally life or death. It may not be the young, healthy person, although we know they too can suffer. But we know we live in a community, right? And so, that spread of bringing it back home and bringing it back to the community, to people who are more vulnerable. There are lives that we can save, and that's what we should be doing. We saw in Katrina, there were lives that could be saved, and we didn't do it, and we lost some. Mm-hmm. Here, there are lives that can be saved, and we're losing 1,000 people a day. That is a Katrina a day. Every 2 days, we're having another Katrina catastrophe. Every 2 days. And we have to do more. We have to do more to address that.
Yeah. I'm really, I'm going to applaud for everyone. I think they would be applauding you from their homes. I like that you sort of ended with that comment about we're in a community together. And I think, like you're saying, the only way through is we have to start looking out for the collective over the individual. So thank you so much, Dr. Jeffries, for joining us. Thank you, everybody in the Zoom call and who watched on Facebook. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Leanne. Thank you, Bexley. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Safe and be well.